Bonjour, hi, bienvenue and welcome everybody, tout le monde, to the joint presidential address de l'Association canadienne de philosophie, the Canadian Philosophical Association. Je voudrais commencer par un land acknowledgement. Je tiens à saluer les peuples autochtones de toutes les terres sur lesquelles nous nous trouvons aujourd'hui. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all Inuit, First Nations and Métis peoples. C'est un grand honneur de vous présenter notre présidente, Christine Tappolet, professeure titulaire chez l'Université de Montréal et directrice du Centre de recherche en éthique. And it is also a great honor to introduce the CPA's 2020 president, Dominic Lopes, distinguished university scholar and professor at the University of British Columbia. Together, they will deliver a joint address, Putting Our Heads Together, la collaboration en philosophie. Please join me in welcoming our presidents.
On behalf of both of us, thank you very much, Jennifer, for the introduction. Thank you all for being here today. So last year, as you all know, the CPA annual meeting, which was to be in London, Ontario, was canceled, and my presidential address was canceled with it. A few weeks later, Christine sent me an email and she said, look, why don't we give a joint address this year? And I was really touched by her generosity. But I thought, you know, this should be Christine's day, so I declined. Christine wasn't having any of it at all. She said the following, she said, you know, we're both experienced at co-authoring, so why don't we work together, collaborate, and do a joint address where we make a case that philosophers should collaborate more. And this was just so clever. Who could say no to that? So here we are today with the talk that we're about to present. By the way, if you think that we're onto something, you might imagine that there's no better place to make contacts and launch collaborations than a meeting like our annual meeting. Face-to-face is better, but we can even make do live. So if we go to the next slide, our main question is it the case that philosophers ought to collaborate more than they do? And in addressing that question, we're going to touch on what the best ways to do philosophy are. And we're going to touch on very lightly the question of what philosophy is. All the while, we're going to assume that the kinds of collaboration that we have in mind are collaborations between philosophers, not between philosophers and other kinds of scholars. So the plan is, first, Christine is going to give us a survey of where we are now when it comes to collaboration of philosophy. And then I'm going to say a few words about why it's probably the case that our current practices are not justified. Then Christine's going to, in light of that, suggest some norms for collaboration. And then we'll conclude. So we turn it over now to Christine.
Yeah, thank you, Don, for turning it over to me. Et je vais parler en français, comme c'est l'habitude pour ce genre d'occasion de présidentielle adresse. Et je vais vous parler un peu de l'état de la philosophie en ce qui concerne la collaboration. Alors, ce qu'on peut remarquer, c'est que la philosophie n'a pas pris le grand tournant de la collaboration, le grand virage à collaboration qu'on peut observer ailleurs dans les sciences, en tout cas depuis le début du XXe siècle. Et c'est quelque chose de très frappant quand on pense aux sciences naturelles en particulier. Elles sont marquées par une tendance spectaculaire vers des collaborations de plus en plus importantes. Par contraste, le philosophe semble toujours adhérer à une règle qu'on pourrait qualifier de règle de recherche monastique privée. Ce ne sont pas mes termes, je les ai trouvés dans la littérature. Alors, le fait indéniable, c'est que les philosophes vivent pour la plupart au XIXe siècle, avant ce grand virage vers la collaboration, ou pire, peut-être au XVIIIe, au XVIIe ou encore avant. Et c'est un point qui est confirmé par l'observation qu'il y a un stéréotype en philosophie, c'est le stéréotype du philosophe solitaire, et c'est un stéréotype très important dans l'imaginaire populaire, comme le montre la fascination que suscitent des figures comme Socrate ou Wittgenstein. Voilà une citation qui va dans ce sens. The stereotype of the philosopher as a solitary reflective scholar persists in the popular imagination, a fact testified by the general public, evident fascination for biographical details of luminaries such as Ludwig Wittgenstein, Bertrand Russell, Karl Popper, and Freddie Ayer. Alors, un autre point qu'on peut noter aussi ici, c'est que, comme Rembrandt le montrait très clairement, il faut avoir une longue barbe blanche pour être philosophe, et il faut aussi pouvoir bénéficier de l'assistance d'une personne, d'une femme qui s'occupe du foyer, du feu dans le foyer. Et on peut peut-être parler de collaboration, mais c'est sans doute plutôt quelque chose d'un autre ordre. Je n'irai pas jusqu'à parler d'exploitation. Pourquoi penser que les philosophes sont en quelque sorte des loups solitaires, travaillent en solitaire? Eh bien, les chiffres nous le disent. Et voici un tableau comparatif, un peu ludique, si vous voyez le détail. Il y a beaucoup d'informations sur le tableau, qui donne de l'information sur le nombre d'auteurs par publication selon les disciplines. Et ça va de 0, il n'y a aucune discipline qui a 0 auteur, on comprend pourquoi, jusqu'à 226,8 pour la physique, la physique nucléaire des autres énergies. Et là, on peut penser à des grosses expériences comme celles qui sont menées au CERN avec des accélérateurs de particules impressionnants. Le grand collisionneur de Hadron fait presque 27 km. Donc, il y a besoin de beaucoup de gens pour observer ce genre de choses. Où en sont les philosophes? Eh bien, les philosophes sont tout en haut à gauche, dans la catégorie des loups solitaires et en compagnie de la littérature, des études littéraires. Une bonne question, puisqu'on a le tableau devant nous, c'est la question de savoir quel modèle de collaboration il faudrait envisager pour les philosophes. Est-ce qu'il faudrait s'en aller du côté de la physique des hautes énergies, ou bien est-ce qu'il y a d'autres modèles de collaboration qui seraient plus intéressants? Nous allons y revenir. Quelques statistiques. Alors, à partir de Web of Science pour les années 2014-2019, ce qu'on observe, c'est qu'en philosophie, sur le nombre d'articles qui sont comptabilisés, il y a un peu plus de 90% d'articles qui sont le fait d'un seul auteur. Donc, ça fait 10% d'articles qui sont en collaboration à 2 ou plus. Et c'est quelque chose qui est intéressant à comparer avec d'autres disciplines. Si vous prenez dans ce tableau-là, par exemple, la ligne qui concerne l'économie, c'est la dernière ligne, là, il y a 24% seulement d'articles qui sont à un seul auteur. Donc, c'est vraiment un chiffre très différent. Nous sommes allés voir les chiffres de Phil Papers, c'est l'information que nous avons eue en mars 2021, c'est que 85,5% des articles sont des articles écrits en solo, en tout cas signés d'une seule personne. Ce qui fait qu'en moyenne, si on prend ces deux chiffres, on peut dire qu'approximativement entre 10 et 15% des articles sont le fait de plus d'un auteur, donc des articles écrits en collaboration. À ce point, on pourrait se dire cet argument ne marche pas très bien parce qu'on oublie un fait, le fait qu'en fait, il y a différentes formes de collaboration qui existent. En philosophie, ce qu'on va faire, c'est discuter beaucoup. On va aussi prendre en compte les résultats, les retours qu'on reçoit lors d'une présentation, et on va prendre en compte les retours qu'on reçoit quand on se fait évaluer par des pairs lors d'une soumission à un journal. Il y a d'autres formes de collaboration encore, et ça, c'est quelque chose qui compte. C'est des formes de collaboration qui sont réelles et qui se manifestent lors d'une publication sous la forme des remerciements qu'on appelle conceptuels, c'est des remerciements substantiels, qu'on s'est fait poser une question, quelque chose de ce genre. Alors, ce qui est intéressant, c'est qu'on remarque une augmentation importante de ces remerciements dits conceptuels jusqu'à la fin des années 70, il y avait au maximum par année 19% d'articles qui avaient ce genre de remerciements, tandis que dans les années 90, eh bien, ce chiffre monte à 83%. Et voilà pour Mind les statistiques des articles comportant des remerciements conceptuels. Donc ça passe de 10% à 90%, presque 90, un peu plus de 90% pour les années 90, pardon. Donc voilà le point qu'on peut conclure. On pourrait se dire, eh bien, le fait que les philosophes ne co-signent pas les articles n'est pas significatif, puisqu'il y a d'autres formes de collaboration. Toutefois, je crois que ça serait allé trop vite, et ce qu'il faut voir, c'est que en fait, ce n'est pas évident que l'augmentation de ces remerciements dits substantiels ou conceptuels corresponde à une réelle augmentation au niveau de la collaboration. Il est bien possible que les auteurs simplement soient un petit peu plus méticuleux en ce qui concerne leurs échanges et qu'ils ont tendance à noter un peu plus quels étaient les échanges qu'ils ont eus sans que vraiment ça représente un changement au niveau des pratiques. De plus, cette collaboration qu'on peut qualifier de sous-autorat, sub-authorship, se distingue d'une collaboration réelle au sens propre. Faire un commentaire au sujet d'un article, poser une question, c'est pas encore participer pleinement à l'écriture d'un article. Donc en général, on peut conclure qu'il y a très peu de collaboration entre les philosophes, beaucoup moins qu'entre les chercheurs qui appartiennent à d'autres disciplines. Et là, je m'arrête pour donner la parole à Dom.
Thank you, Christine. So then the question is, what should we think about this? You know, philosophy is an institution. And so we might recognize that our inquiries, what we do to advance philosophical knowledge, take place in a social context. And it could be that facts about that social context explain the situation that Christine has just described. And perhaps those facts, those explanatory facts, also justify the situation that Christine has described. So let's see if we could take this seriously. Sometimes people point out that there's a kind of a possibility of normative inertia in our practices. In other words, we have learned from our supervisors who learned from their supervisors who learned from their supervisors, and none of us have ever taught how to collaborate. And so the non-collaborative practice has simply persisted. But I think that's too pessimistic. The interesting thing about the Mind data is it shows that either we are engaging more in sub-authorial collaboration, or that we are now acknowledging existing sub-authorial collaboration. Either way, there's a norm that's changed. So we are capable of changing our stripes. That should be a relief to us all, that we can change and improve our norms. It's often pointed out that in the last century, scientific co-authorship increased in correlation with funding for the sciences. And so people say there isn't the same kind of funding for philosophy. And so what explains the prevalence of single authorship in philosophy is the funding situation. I'm not sure that this is a great explanation. After all, Canadian philosophers are frankly much better funded than American philosophers, but it doesn't seem that we are stars when it comes to collaboration. We seem to collaborate no more than philosophers in the United States. And in any case, this kind of line is not likely to be a good justification, because if it turns out, and it seems to be the case, that collaboration has been good for science, good for other disciplines, for the natural and social sciences, if it's accelerated progress in those fields, then perhaps it would in philosophy as well. So let's take the emphasis off the social and social epistemic and place it on the epistemic side of things. After all, you might think that our epistemic practices, that our epistemic goals have determined the social context in which we pursue them. So we've arranged our social life in order to further our epistemic goals. Here on the face of it, it would look like it would be hard to make this argument. Here you have Kim Sterelny just pointing out how unusual philosophers are. In human problem solving, people tend to depend on communal resources. Scientists are an example of that, and philosophers aren't. And there's a good explanation for why we would tend to solve collective problems by drawing on communal resources. If we have a method of inquiry that can be decomposed into relatively discrete tasks, and those relatively discrete tasks can be assigned to different members of a team, we can all work in parallel to solve the problem and hence be more efficient. And if the members of the team are experts with respect to those tasks, we can multiply that acceleration, make it even faster. And in fact, some philosophers, maybe 10 or 15% of philosophers, do adopt a model like that. So the question really becomes, why not more? What's the justification for the number that we have right now? The explanation of that I just gave of Sterelny's observation about division of labor, the explanation in terms of division of labor, maybe suggests where we can look for a justification of the prevalence of the solitary wolf in the philosophy ecosystem. The justification could be that there are some conceptions of philosophy, there are no methods that can be decomposed into discrete tasks that get assigned to different members of a team. So here's just one example of a conception of philosophy that I think beautifully articulates that kind of reasoning. This is shared by Bernard Williams in a 2006 article and Arthur Danto in a presidential address to the APA in 1984. And Williams, these are quotes from Williams, he says it really beautifully here. Some philosophy should fear failing in ways that literature can fail. And what he has in mind here is that one thing that philosophy does, or one thing that some philosophy does, is it provides intellectual resources for building culture. And when that's what you're trying to do, it doesn't, the conditions of your success don't depend on your forging a consensus between parties who otherwise disagree. You might have your cultural viewpoint and not worry about the disagreement of others. You're articulating what's up in your culture. And you might notice that very often in philosophy, new arguments, new ideas, new conceptions rather change the subject entirely instead of presenting us with a solution to an old problem. They leave the old problem behind. So he says, oh, if you could go back, sorry. I was just gonna say something about the third quotation there. He puts this in terms of the manner of the work of philosophy expressing something, requiring an imaginative achievement. Here's how Arthur Danto puts the same point. He says, sometimes philosophers have new thoughts that require them to invent new forms of expression. So I think that they're both hinting at the idea that for some kinds of philosophy, the content cannot be separated from the vehicle. The manner of expression is part of what's said. That's the imaginative achievement. So I think we can go to the next slide. And what I've done here is I've just tried to represent what the reasoning might be in a very straightforward form. For some cases of philosophy, success is a function of writerly imagination or expressive power. And writerly imagination or expressive power are individual. They are done by individuals. And so some philosophy demands solo writing. Now, this is a logically valid argument. Take a look at premise 2. Imagination, writerly imagination and expressive power are individual pursuits. That's a very interesting idea. There's something about literature that is individualistic. Let's just grant it's true. Maybe we can come back into discussion to think about whether or not it is true. Let's focus on 1. Notice the quantifier. Sometimes success is a function of writerly imagination or expressive power. And that seems true. If we move on to the next slide, here's how I think about it. A couple of litmus tests. Litmus test number 1. Can you think of some philosophers who present us with a philosophy, a philosophical vision through the totality of their work? And you think, you know, nobody else would have thought of that. If it weren't for them, we never would have thought of that. And I'm sure that we all will have different lists, but I would put Danto and Williams on my list, and I would put David Lewis and Philip Foot on that list as well. And we might disagree, but it doesn't really matter as long as we agree that there are some philosophers of whom they're past this litmus test, of whom this description is true. Here's litmus test number 2. Those 4 images are photographs by Steve Pike. Steve Pike took portraits of some well-known philosophers, but I think he chose very carefully. And I think that he achieved a particular kind of success because he manages to portray these philosophers in a way that conveys something of their philosophical sensibility. And so that philosophical sensibility is individualized, it's captured in their faces. So it looks to me like there's some truth in premise number 1. So if we go into the next slide, we should grant that the argument is a sound argument, it's logically valid, and the premises are true. But the question will then be, how often is the first premise true? It seems that the number of philosophers who pass those 2 litmus tests is much smaller than the number of us who are lone wolves who rarely collaborate or never collaborate with each other. So if we go on to the next slide, you might think, okay, so what? We're overgeneralizing, but it's kind of harmless to overgeneralize. So some of us think that we have the kind of vision that very few philosophers really have, but that's a harmless overgeneralization. In fact, maybe it's beneficial. Maybe we do better work by imagining ourselves to be David Lewis or Philippa Foot. I think we should pause though, because there's a dark side of the story as well. So let me describe the chart that you're looking at. Along the x-axis, you see various disciplines arranged according to how strong the emphasis is on brilliance for success in that discipline. So in psychology and history, there's a very little emphasis on brilliance in order to be a good psychologist or good historian. Philosophy is the outlier. We have a unique emphasis on brilliance compared to these other disciplines. And there's a stereotype about women that they are rarely brilliant. And so there's an interaction here, and you see that we have a lower, this is the y-axis, a lower percentage of women awarded doctorates in philosophy. The line shows that this is a significant correlation. If we move on to the next slide, we see the same thing with race. So philosophy is an outlier. Notice that the sciences have been thrown in here as well. There's a stereotype that philosophy requires brilliance. There's the stereotype that Black people don't have it. And the result is this line that shows a significant correlation with philosophy really suffering. In case you're interested, there's no correlation when it comes to Asians, South and East Asians. So moving on to the final slide, this section, here's some lessons to draw. One is we have this false belief that philosophy requires brilliance. It's a false belief because very few of us are brilliant in the way that our great exemplars might be. And this false belief can't justify anything. But more importantly than that, this false belief, this stereotype, interacts with biases about other people that are both unjust. They're unjust because they discourage people from becoming philosophers and perhaps realizing their full potential. And in addition to being unjust, this interaction between the two stereotypes is epistemically very bad. It's very bad because progress in philosophy probably depends upon having a lot of different perspectives at the table, perspectives that represent people who are coming from different walks of life. And in fact, if you buy the Williams and Danto kind of line about how some philosophy articulates a conception of culture, of who we are, you should be especially worried about who's excluded in the articulation of those conceptions. So I think that the Williams-Danto argument is true. I think it's a good argument, but it doesn't get us all the way to where we need to be in order to justify our practices. What we can say is that a few of us who are solitary authors should be solitary authors. For the rest of us, I think we need to do some soul searching and ask ourselves whether in being lone wolves, we are also really rising to the standard of being the kinds of philosophers who are articulating visions that cannot be expressed except in a way that requires this kind of literary, writerly imagination and expressive power. So the upshot is that we should consider changing some of our norms. Now I'll turn it over to Christine.
Merci. Et la question que nous allons nous poser maintenant, c'est celle de savoir quelles sont les normes de collaboration qu'on devrait adopter en philosophie. Et ça, c'est une question pour laquelle il faut commencer à réfléchir à une question de métaphilosophie, c'est-à-dire celle de savoir ce que nous essayons de faire quand nous faisons de la philosophie. Car la réponse à la question de savoir quelles sont les normes à adopter va dépendre de la question de savoir ce qu'on essaie de faire, de ce que c'est que la philosophie. Alors, ce que nous proposons, c'est une conception pluraliste en ce qui concerne la nature de la philosophie. Il y a toutes sortes de choses qui peuvent être envisagées et qui sont tout à fait convenables. La philosophie pourrait être une sorte de recherche du bonheur ou de la sagesse. La philosophie pourrait être une tentative de faire sens du monde autour de nous. La philosophie pourrait avoir comme but de répondre aux questions qui sont trop difficiles pour les disciplines scientifiques. Je me souviens d'avoir entendu Ned Block parler de la philosophie en ces termes. La philosophie pourrait être une activité qui est simplement essayer de répondre aux questions trop difficiles pour toutes les disciplines, quelles qu'elles soient. Et peut-être celle qui prête le moins à la controverse, c'est l'idée sur laquelle la philosophie est une activité qui vise à répondre à des questions philosophiques. C'est évidemment quelque chose d'un peu tautologique. Il faudrait savoir ce qu'on entend par question philosophique, bien sûr. Il y a d'autres possibilités. Nous ne voulons pas ici offrir une liste fermée de conception de la philosophie. Mais quelle que soit la conception de la philosophie que l'on adopte, nous pensons qu'il y a un devoir qui est présomptif ou défaisable à collaborer. Et c'est ce que cette thèse-là, c'est ce qu'on va essayer, je vais essayer de défendre, trouver des arguments. Mais avant de le faire, avant de présenter un argument pour cette thèse, je voulais simplement vous présenter les différentes possibilités, les grandes tendances au niveau normatif qu'on pourrait envisager en ce qui concerne la philosophie, et peut-être que vous allez vous reconnaître. Alors, on peut distinguer trois sortes de normes ou familles de normes. La première, c'est ce qu'on peut appeler la norme individuelle ou individualiste, sur laquelle un philosophe devrait travailler de manière entièrement autonome, en solitaire, si possible dans un sous-sol. C'est donc une norme possible, une approche possible. Ensuite, il y a une norme, une famille de normes qu'on peut appeler libérale. Et l'idée, c'est que le philosophe peut faire comme bon lui semble. Il peut collaborer ou non selon son tempérament, selon son goût. C'est une question donc ouverte, il n'y a pas de nécessité à la collaboration. Ensuite, il y a la norme qu'on peut qualifier de radicale, et j'avoue que je la trouve assez séduisante. C'est la norme sur laquelle les philosophes devraient collaborer. Donc, voici l'éventail des normes. Et pour commencer, voici un argument assez simple, hein. Il est vrai en faveur de la norme radicale. Alors, ce qu'on peut noter, c'est qu'il y a des avantages hédoniques. C'est plus le fun de travailler à plusieurs. Et si vous n'avez pas eu la chance de le faire, demandez à ceux qui le font. C'est assez évident. Ensuite, il y a un avantage épistémique. Dom en a parlé un peu. C'est, je pense, assez facile de tomber d'accord sur le fait qu'on peut arriver à des meilleurs résultats quand on travaille en collaboration. On peut avoir des discussions qui se basent sur une connaissance plus vaste de la littérature. On peut se prévaloir d'une puissance de calcul ou d'une puissance de raisonnement démultipliée. Collaborer permet aussi de mettre ensemble un ensemble de perspectives, tenir compte d'un ensemble de perspectives, de sorte à jeter des éclairages différents sur une même question. Et il y a cette thèse qui paraît assez plausible, sur laquelle, quand on met ensemble deux têtes, eh bien, on a en fait quelque chose de plus que simplement un facteur 2 au niveau de l'amélioration du résultat. Two heads are really more than twice better than one. Quelque chose qui a été écrit et soutenu par Paul Taggart. Bon, maintenant, vous allez me dire que c'est un peu de voir la vie en rose que de parler que des avantages. Et c'est vrai qu'il y a aussi quelques coûts. Alors, ça peut être un peu fatigant de collaborer, ça peut être un peu difficile. Et il y a des coûts aussi au niveau épistémique. Vous pouvez tomber sur des collaborateurs incompétents, qui ne sont pas fiables ou carrément méchants et malveillants. Que conclure à partir de là? Eh bien, je pense qu'on peut se mettre d'accord que les raisons en faveur de la collaboration sont bien plus importantes que les raisons contre la collaboration. Et ça, c'est surtout vrai si on tient compte du fait que, en fait, il y a toutes sortes de choses que vous pouvez faire pour diminuer les risques d'une collaboration. Vous pouvez choisir les personnes avec qui vous collaborez et vous pouvez aussi apprendre à éviter les difficultés de la collaboration, j'y reviendrai. Donc, il s'ensuit que les philosophes, si on examine toutes ces raisons pour et contre, devraient collaborer. Ils ont un devoir de collaborer. Une bonne question ici, et il va falloir qu'on y réfléchisse plus, c'est de savoir si c'est un devoir épistémique qui viendrait s'ajouter aux devoirs moraux que nous aurions aussi sans doute en faveur de la collaboration. Épistémique parce que la raison principale pour laquelle il est important de collaborer, c'est le gain épistémique qu'on peut faire. Maintenant, on pourrait penser que la norme radicale est simplement trop radicale. Est-ce que ce n'est pas quelque chose d'indûment exigeant? On peut s'imaginer que les philosophes n'aimeraient pas se faire imposer ce genre de normes. Une police de la philosophie peut-être pourrait vérifier si vous avez assez collaboré cette année. On a un peu peur de cette idée-là. Mais surtout, si on repense à l'argument qui a été présenté par Dom, qu'en est-il du genre de projet décrit par Williams et par Danto? Est-ce que cette norme ne viendrait pas empêcher la poursuite d'un projet qui pourtant semble avoir de la valeur? La solution que nous proposons est assez simple. Nous proposons de remplacer la norme radicale par une thèse plus faible, qui est cette thèse en termes de devoir défaisable. C'est la norme modeste, les philosophes ont un devoir défaisable de collaborer. Une sorte de présomption à la collaboration. À partir de là, toutes sortes de questions bien intéressantes se posent. On peut se demander quelles sont les formes de collaboration qu'on devrait envisager en philosophie. Ce qu'on vous proposerait, ce serait un modèle qui vient des sciences fondamentales, la physique théorique, qui procède le plus souvent par des collaborations qui regroupent 2 ou 3 personnes, en moyenne 3 chercheurs du même niveau. Donc quelque chose qui se situe non pas dans une relation d'un maître de laboratoire ou d'un propriétaire de laboratoire et de ses assistants, mais quelque chose qui se situe dans un modus vivendi égalitaire. Une autre très bonne question qui mériterait qu'on développe plus, c'est la question de savoir ce qui est requis pour parvenir à collaborer avec d'autres philosophes. Alors, comme Taggart le souligne dans son article, c'est important d'avoir un savoir-faire en ce qui concerne les bonnes manières de collaborer. Il y a toutes sortes de trucs sur lesquels nous pourrons revenir, si vous le voulez, lors des discussions. Dom et moi, ayant de l'expérience, on pourra vous apprendre 2 ou 3 choses. Mais il y a aussi un certain nombre d'attitudes, comme l'attitude de respect ou de la confiance, ou aussi de la modestie. Si vous voulez... Si votre ego est trop important, vous n'allez jamais réussir à collaborer de manière efficace avec qui que ce soit. Il y a un certain nombre d'habiletés sociales qui sont importantes pour collaborer. On peut penser à l'intelligence émotionnelle. Il faut arriver à voir que votre collaborateur n'est pas très heureux de votre choix terminologique ou de votre choix éditorial ou de la décision de couper une partie à laquelle il a beaucoup contribué. Et finalement, d'une manière plus générale, il y a un certain nombre de vertus, certaines épistémiques, clairement épistémiques, d'autres qui pourraient être morales, comme la curiosité, la patience, le courage, qui sont importantes et qu'il faut développer. Donc voilà des champs de recherche qu'il faudrait examiner de plus près, mais ce sont des choses qui sont nécessaires pour la collaboration de toute évidence. Je passe à l'anglais pour la conclusion, puisque c'est très important, la conclusion. To conclude, let me state that the main claims we want to make are the following. So first, philosophers ought to put their heads together more often than they do. We have this defeasible duty to collaborate. Now, there's a fact, as I just explained, collaboration requires special skills. And this makes for a few implications that are interesting and that we want to underscore. First, philosophers themselves ought to develop these skills, but also it seems true that they should teach the students how to collaborate. They should help the students to acquire these skills. So this much Dom and I agree upon. We also agree that if we were to disagree on something, we should make it explicit. So here I go. Fortunately enough, we didn't disagree a lot. We disagreed quite a lot on the format of the presentation. We disagree quite a bit on whether to use Keynote or PowerPoint. And I wanted to thank you, Dom, for letting me having my way with PowerPoint. I know it's inferior, but it makes my life much easier. So, right.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you, everybody.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much for that. We'll be starting with question period in just a minute. We'll take maybe a 1-minute break if anybody wants to get a drink of water or something like that. If you would like to ask a question, please write the word question or peut-être question in the chat, and we'll take questions in the order they come in, and we'll also have follow-up questions. Just indicate in your question that it is a follow-up and whose question you're following up on. But let's take 1 moment before we start question period, if anybody needs to refresh themselves, and we'll resume at 7:12. Sure. Let's go ahead now because it is 7:12. So Louis-Philippe.
Yes, thank you for this very interesting presentation. I just wanted to ask you, so you presented us with a lot of numbers early on, and then later in the talk you made the claim that 2 heads are better than 1, and you didn't have any numbers on that. And I was wondering, were you tempted at all to see if papers authored by more than 1 philosophers are overrepresented in the best journals or in the Philosophers Annual, or whether they tend to get more citations? And if you haven't looked at that, what's your hunch? My hunch is that they're not. My hunch is that the most influential papers in philosophy tend to be single authored. And I don't think it's obvious that there's this epistemic benefit if you look at how things come out, but I'm curious to know what you think. Thank you.
So maybe I can just make a remark. There's a study, but not for philosophy, where people have looked at a retraction of papers. And apparently it looks better in terms of retraction of papers when you have more than, you have a bigger group or something like that. So yeah, it's interesting. We should have a look. I'm not quite sure why you think that co-authored papers are not as prestigious, wonderful, and important in philosophy as compared to a co-authored paper. But
I don't mean to say that they're not as, but I just mean, like, I think, if I think of Phil Review and Mind and so on, I don't feel like they have a surprising number of co-authored paper. I think it looks like any other journal, these very prestigious journals.
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to look at that, but it could be that the the sort of standard image of the lone wolf is still something that matters for these journals and for the selection of the papers. So I would put a grain of salt in terms of the number, but it would be interesting to look at the numbers. Yeah, Don?
Yeah, Louis-Philippe, I think that's a great point. But we would really need a reliable measure of philosophical quality. And placement in journals is a very, very rough measure of that, in my view. And citations are also a very, very rough measure of that, in my view. So I think it would be very hard to do. And there's probably also a counterfactual element to all of this as well. So it could be that those papers would not have been as good as they currently are without the collaboration that took place. Right, so it's not straightforward bibliometrics.
Yeah, tough question there. Kimberly Brownlee, you had the next question.
Thank you both. That was very interesting, and I endorse the recommendations to us. I had 2 quick questions. One was to ask if you could say a bit more about the epistemic costs and the feeling we have sometimes that we can talk each other out of our more crazy ideas, the ones that might be more provocative, that might actually push things, that the conservative peer review process can rein us in when we're collaborating. And also in the case of science and mathematics collaborations, sometimes they collaborate because each person doesn't have the skills, the resources to write the paper alone. And what would the philosophical equivalent look like?
Right. So the epistemic cost I was considering was slightly different, but I think there might be a cost in having papers that are not, radical enough or too shy, and so we might have less interesting papers because they're just more standard and less new, and that might be a risk. I'm not sure why collaboration would tend towards that, but I agree that as it stands, the refereeing process has this tendency. The papers that finally pass several bad-tempered referees usually are papers that are pretty standard. They just add a little picture or something to the literature, which I find somewhat sad, actually. So I would agree that that would be a cost, right? And remind me of the second question, because
It was when mathematicians and scientists collaborate, they usually are bringing distinctive skills that they couldn't write.
I can give an example. I'm often collaborating with Mauro Rossi, and he knows the literature on well-being and also some empirical literature more than I do. And I know the literature on emotions more than he does. And so that's quite useful. So that's a standard, straightforward example. Sometimes you have, people who are good at thinking and not good at writing. You could have these teams as well.
Yeah, if I could jump in here, Kim, you and I should collaborate. We're down the hall from each other, right? So on the cost side, we all know what writing by committee is like. Yeah, so that's a danger that we need to avoid. That's why I would favor the defeasible norm, where the defeater is, I am doing this thing that is expressing an individual vision, or I have this crazy idea that nobody else is going to come in on, but it needs to be out there. Those are the kind of defeaters that I think should defeat the norm, rather than it's too hard, or I can't find anybody, or I'm a grumpy character. Those aren't the defeaters that I think are the valid defeaters. On the distinct skill sets, if you just think about any good philosophy department, how much you learn from talking with your colleagues and how much of that goes into your writing, why not bring it all the way in? I think it's there, perhaps in a less dramatic way than in other disciplines, but we do know different things and we have different modes of thought. And we do milk each other for that, but we do it in this very distant way. And I think that we could perhaps do better by engaging in a more intimate way.
Thanks for that. Tristan Gates.
Thank you. I enjoyed that talk a lot. So I have a pair of questions that come from the fact that this is a bilingual collaboration. The first is, it struck me while I was listening to this bilingual presentation, it reminded me of another presidential address from a few years ago that I think Daniel Weinstock gave about the challenges to having a bilingual association in the 21st century. And I was curious what your thoughts were about the possibility for more collaborations between philosophers who speak different languages as a way of addressing some of those difficulties. But I was also curious whether there were any particular challenges that the two of you ran into because of collaborating across a language divide.
I'll say my written French, which was the first draft of my slides, was pretty stiff and clumsy, and I owe Christine a big thanks for making it smooth, for smoothing it over. So yeah, there are linguistic barriers.
Yeah.
I don't know if the linguistic barrier was an opportunity also. It might have been in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea that we should foster at the level of the CPA bilingual collaborations. But you know, there was this joke this morning at the radio of someone. She said, "Yeah, it's so strange. You know, French-speaking Canadian, they seem to be just born with, you know, this competency in English. That's how." She was making fun of the situation, but it's something that's quite striking. All the French-speaking philosophers, most of them, are more or less bilingual. They have heavy accents and make mistakes, but you know, they can follow a conversation and have a discussion, which is not so much the case for the rest of Canada, philosophers from the rest of Canada. So I'm not sure it will work, but we could try and foster that. I mean, I take it as a nice suggestion that we could try and work on. Maybe we should have some compulsory bilingual collaborations at the Montreal event next year.
Just a shout out for Dialogue. Dialogue, which is the CPA's journal, is adopting a new format that will allow for more interactions and the part of the idea is for those interactions to be bilingual. So you could have a number of philosophers engaging with each other, francophones in French and anglophones in English.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais essayer de parler français. Peter Deitch, vous êtes le prochain? Le prochain.
Thank you. And thanks for collaborating, for leading by example and collaborating on this presidential address. So my first question, I'd like to agree with you that two heads are more than twice as good as one. But then there's also a part of me that wants to play devil's advocate and say, well, if that's true, and I think it is true, then why aren't people collaborating more already? Because there's this epistemic gain to be had. Why is it not? Why don't we go and get that gain, right? And then the second question, which is in a way linked to Louis Philippe's question, is, well, might there be some obstacles to us realizing this gain? And there I would not so much ask as Louis Philippe did, are the most influential papers solo published, but are there perhaps practices in journals that disfavor co-authored papers? And we might be able to get some statistics on acceptance rates and so on, desk rejections, who knows? But again, I agree with Dominic that we'd have to somehow control for the quality of those papers, which is very difficult. I'll leave it there. Maybe
just to jump in on your last point, Peter, I think there is a cost in terms of, for a younger scholar. There's obviously a cost to collaborate these days, because it's still very much the case in our discipline that your publication file is not going to be assessed the same way if you have lots of collaborative papers. And so if you want tenure, the good advice to younger colleagues is do some collaboration, but be careful. There is still this lone wolf ideology, and it'll be more difficult to get tenure. And it would be interesting to look at the rejection rate as well. There's a grain of salt as well, because it might be that these papers are just not as good as the other ones for some other reasons. But So these are obstacles, and I think this ideology of the lone wolf is still very much with us. Why this is the case, I'm not sure. Why philosophy must be the last one to turn to collaboration? I mean, not completely the last one, but among the last ones, I'm not quite sure. Dom, would you agree with that?
Just two things. First, I think that the reward structure ramifies throughout the career. So, merit pay, job offers, prestige in the discipline. I think that people who frequently co-author it seems to me they probably take a hit on all of those levels. So it's part of the institution that there are disincentives. I was going to say something about the last comment that you just made, but I was just blanked out. I've just forgotten it. It just slipped my mind. Sorry.
My last comment?
Yes.
So my last comment was about the ideology of the lone wolf, that it's still at work, and I'm not sure why. And there must be this ideal of the philosopher who just on his own, his own, and usually it's his own, makes this big difference in the literature. The hero philosopher, I think this has a big role to play in our fantasies. Not mine, but
I'll make a confession. So I don't think that I aspire to be the kind of visionary philosopher, which I gave you 4 examples earlier on. But I do have this sense of having a personal style or voice that matters to me. And when I do collaborate, that goes, right? I collaborate with somebody else, and we compromise, and it's a different, we acquire a different voice. And I think that my guess is that many philosophers in their heart of hearts feel this, that they want to control their writing. Every phrase, the cadence and the metaphors and the jokes, and that all is, it's a personal expression. And the thing is, at the end of the day, there's an indulgence there. But even then, we can sometimes collaborate far more than we do, and enjoy developing a new voice with another person, and still solo author and be that individual. So, you know, there's maybe that could be another defeater. But it's going to be a pretty weak defeater. So we should feel that it's worth it in this case to give up on some of the possible epistemic benefits just to be able to be our special selves.
Yeah, I must say, when I write with other people, I really enjoy being careful about the style as well. And sometimes I make Mao change his examples, and he does that with me as well. So so we work on you know, improving a piece, like finding a group voice, which is nice, which is really nice, which I enjoy.
Thank you for that. Actually, if I can interject, I've also had the experience of co-authoring chiefly review articles with others, and I find I have to keep myself on a short leash, no rhetorical flourishes. But that, I mean, that can be an advantage in something like a review article where, you know, some projection of neutrality is very much appropriate. So, Amy Schmitter has an observation for us. Amy, lovely to see you here. Thank you for the observation. You can click on transcript to switch it off if it's driving you crazy. But good to have you here. Our next question is from Colin McLeod.
Merci, Christine. Thank you, Dom. It seems to me that, as you sort of noted at the beginning, philosophy is extremely collaborative as a professional activity. It's not so collaborative when it comes to the particular thing that you're focusing on, namely publishing papers and books. And I think you were talking about some of the professional incentives that lead to that. So, I mean, I have co-authored with Christine and co-edited a book with her and various others, and I found that a very rewarding experience. But it seems to me, I wonder if you would also be sympathetic to a change in professional norms for the recognition of the work that is done by others, right? So, you know, we're all familiar with, I'd like to thank, and then a long list of people, right? But we also know that there are members of philosophical communities who are remarkably generous with their time. They ask excellent questions, that they go to all the talks and colloquia and so on, and they enrich the community, which counts for nothing in their professional life, except the goodwill of others, right? But there's no mechanism, reliable mechanism for recording those contributions. So I'm wondering if you, in line with your radical proposal, you would be sympathetic to formalizing norms of acknowledgement for professional purposes of the contributions, various, you know, help me with the draft, discussions in the hall, questions at the colloquium, whatever, such that people like me, since I'm also chair of a department, when it comes to evaluating these things, can take those into consideration in ways that I'm more or less precluded from doing so at the moment. Now I look at, you know, the usual things, talks given, mainly essays and books publicized, well, published. Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Colin. I think that would be welcome. Could we imagine of a scheme that allows us to quantify people's input? So I was thinking, you know, the year you spent in Montreal, all of us would have put your name, you know, as a co-author. You contributed so much to all the discussions. So yeah, there should be a way. I'm not quite sure whether it's feasible, and maybe then our papers wouldn't count as much because we would have other people too easily as co-authors. But yeah, there should be a scheme. We should find something out.
So when I read the article that contains the study of the century of mind, the journal Mind, that 100 years of publication in mind, I really did. I had a very vague sense of what even sub-authorial collaboration is, and they're very specific about the various forms it takes and the various acknowledgement practices in different disciplines and how different disciplines do it. And it got me thinking, and I actually decided that from now on, when I do my acknowledgements, I won't just list people who've contributed. I will say, for each of them, I will write a sentence saying what they contributed. And you should be able to tell from that how important it was. That article also points out that in some disciplines, if you're having a conversation with an author and you give them a piece of the puzzle, they'll make you a co-author. Like the paper will just come out with your name on it, perhaps without you even knowing it. Now that is going even further, right, than I've decided to do. That would be crazy. That would not be accepted in our discipline right now. There would be pushback against it, but it may be interesting to think about some of those bolder models.
Thanks for that. Our next question is from Haskell von Kriegstein.
Hi. I was just, so it's a little bit of a follow-up on the exchange you had with Kimberly earlier. So it seems to me like one of the reasons, like it's connected, the lack of co-authorship, with the fact that we're making all these like tiny incremental moves in journal articles. So because when we get to the point where we make these tiny incremental moves, we just like don't have many people that agree with us on all the tiny details that we're writing about. So in my own experience, it's like this, like I have like a reading group with like a lot of people about like some topics, and we have like, and with a couple of those people, I have like broad agreement about like what the right view roughly is. But when it comes to the point where I would actually write an article, it gets like into such a little detail of the view usually that nobody I talk to agrees with me. And that's the reason why we don't collaborate, because we actually don't agree on the thing that ultimately goes into the journal. So that's sort of like just like my observation of like what typically like hinders me from co-authoring. I just like don't have anybody who agrees with me, like everybody, you know, the things I want to say. But then I'm wondering, I mean, there's a certain form of article that one could write, and like but I can only think of one example in philosophy, which is like an article from the 90s. I just looked it up, by Rabinovich and Oesterberg, on value based on preferences and economics and philosophy of 1996. And in that article, the two authors sort of like they lay out a lot of the terrain, and then towards the end they say, well, here's like where we kind of like part ways, right? And so like Oesterberg thinks this and Rabinovich thinks this, and they kind of have like the last section of the paper where they say, okay, here's like where we have like two different views on like the detail, whatever, right? And I mean, I think there's a great way to write an article. I'm just not sure like how many, like it would be a risk to submit an article like that, because it's just not like, I'm not sure how editors would react to that. So given that I like still have to make tenure, I probably wouldn't like try to like get an article like that published, because you know, there's like less risky ways to spend my time.
I want to jump up and down about this. I think philosophers have some bad habits. I thank you for the question. It's great, but I think we have some bad habits. One is that we feel that we are personally committed to the arguments that we give, and we shouldn't be. Argument, you write it down, it goes out there, and it's in the world, it's on its own, like an adult child. And so when people, you know, they hear me say something and they say, how is that consistent with something you wrote in 1995? I'm like, I don't care. Let's talk about this article that I wrote now, right? It's not about, I think we overvalue. And so that connects with worrying too much about disagreeing. So Christine and I disagree about a bunch of stuff. It's okay. You know, we acknowledge some of it. Some of it is not worth acknowledging. We don't need to be so precious about, you know, Christine agrees with this and not this, etc. You know, the value is in the argument that's in the paper, not in it's being my argument versus her argument. right? The argument stands on its own. And another bad habit is, so setting aside, you're coming up for tenure and you just have to get the papers out. We should be a little bit less tolerant of tiny incremental moves. And if part of what's driving the publication of papers with tiny incremental moves is that that's what you do as a solo author, then that's another reason to collaborate and put yourself in a position to be making the big, bold moves. And that probably means collaborating with somebody who's quite different from you, right? So you're going to expect disagreements, but they're not going to be the ones that matter for the bold moves that you're making.
Yeah, you need some agreement, of course, but some of the disagreement you have with a collaborator is okay. I even have some disagreement with Mauro. This is the case, not many, but some. And on moods, we have a different theory of moods. And it has been a while, that's so. But what I wanted to stress is that, of course, if you publish something, it has to be new and original. But then you shouldn't commit the fallacy that it's, it has to be new and original, so it has to be your own points. You can share views with others. They haven't published it, and so you can share on your side, or you can publish with the other person, and it's new and original and worth publishing. So I think there's often this fallacy that to be new and original, you have to disagree with the rest of the world. That's not the case. So, right.
Thanks for that. Our next question is from Amy Schmitter. And just before she asks her question, as we're getting to the bottom of the queue, I wanted to let you all know that there is a networking lounge that is available after the session. If you want to just go hang out informally and say hi to other people at the session, our host will be dropping a link to that lounge in the chat. And you can hit that when the session is wrapping up to join us for some informal networking. Amy Schmitter, go ahead.
Yes, since Jennifer outed me, I was not maintaining that ghostly presence that I wanted to do. So actually, my points or questions might be informed by the fact that I'm actually working in a solitary way on a paper that needs to be done like tomorrow during this. But what I wanted to do is maybe sort of pick up on what Colin was saying and push it a little bit more. I mean, I'm certainly not, let me make it clear, I'm not against collaboration, but I think that we actually do quite a bit of it, and in different ways, but just as much as a number of other disciplines. What we're doing right now is an example. If you, I mean, let me make a broad generalization, but a number of other disciplines, not only do they not ask questions like this, they kind of get offended at that. Their questions to be more of like, expand on what you just said, which is great, fine. I mean, but it's a different form of interaction. Whereas, I mean, one of the reasons why I love the kind of public part of philosophy of presenting papers is because you do get that sort of collaborative energies. And so I think, I mean, I guess part of what I'm saying is I think the emphasis on actual co-authorship might be missing a lot. Having said that, I was actually struck in your graphs that, now I'm forgetting exactly what it was, but that the other lone wolf with us was literature or creative writing. Which is interesting because maybe they have a brilliance problem there too, although I don't think it's as gendered as Dom was pointing out. But again, perhaps I'm drawing too much from my own current experience of being buried deep in this paper and trying to fight my way out of it. For me, a lot of my thinking is done in the writing. Which I think might actually make it more like the other, literature and creative writing example. A lot of the, I should say maybe the final polishing thinking is done in the writing, which is, makes it hard, I think, to do with other people. Maybe I'm missing something there, but I think it is hard to do with other people. Though I'm not Dom just dismissed this. I'm not so much concerned with my personal style, but I would at least like to be consistent with what I said like a month ago. And that's also something that the kind of writing of it does. So yeah, I mean, I have in various ways collaborated with people, especially editing is one thing, which is, and even in one case, writing a paper with somebody, and it was not really productive. I mean, the editing stuff was, I meant the writing of paper was not super productive, maybe because we didn't figure out the right techniques for doing it, but also because we were, I think, trying to think it out on paper, and it didn't work so well.
So maybe concerning this idea that most of the thinking is done while you're writing. So two thoughts. One is that some collaborators actually sit down in front of one computer, I guess. They haven't yet figured out how to have two input into the text, I think, and they write together. I wouldn't have the patience for that. But I believe in plans. And I think if you make a careful plan, then you can, share the sections. That's what I'm usually doing. And so one person writes part of the section and the other person writes the other of the section, then we read and comment and so on. And so if you think that much of the thinking is done at the level of the plan, you really can move forward, I think. Now, I agree that we put the emphasis on co-authorship, but I think that's because co-authorship is really, I mean, I've done lots of edited collection, but there you don't really have to agree on much, you just agree on the list of good people that you want to invite and so on, and then you have to comment. You do the commenting usually individually. So really co-authorship is what marks a collaboration, a genuine collaboration, I believe, in terms of research.
So we did in the first section acknowledge how much philosophy is, I think it is an outlier when it comes to the depth and texture of sub-authorial collaboration. And we talk a lot, we argue against each other, we are, this is really important. We not acknowledge that, but we should not make that a laurel to rest upon. I think we can acknowledge that that's a good thing and still consider whether we can do better as co-authors. I completely understand what you're saying about thinking on paper, and you and I might be less like Christine, more like each other. I do have a plan, but it's so sketchy that the plan is not really what keeps, when I have co-authored, it's not what keeps me and my co-author on track. And so what I found, I have done the thing where you sit together with a person at the computer, and that's great, but you need the right person. It needs to be the right relationship. Otherwise, I think that you just have a rough logic. Like, what's the first thing you need? And one of you writes that down and you get an agreement on that. And then you move on to the next thing that you need. And you move on to the next thing you need. So you don't have to have, for me, I can't do a plan in advance, but I can do that. And that's enough to get co-authorship going.
Sounds a bit like expressive art.
Okay, well, thank you so much to both of our speakers. Merci pour cette collaboration. And unless there are any other questions, perhaps I'll invite you to join us over at the networking hangout. But first, I'd like to invite you to thank our speakers for a wonderful presidential address and a great
Thanks
example. Okay.
Thank you.
À bientôt.
Okay, I'll head over there now. See you over there.
Okay, see you there.
See you then.